Rhetoric began as a discipline in ancient Greece that was supposed to prepare citizens for arguing in court. And when we're talking about rhetoric, we still rely very heavily on Aristotle, the philosopher, who believed that we need to understand rhetoric for two reasons. One, to effectively make arguments, our own arguments, and two, so that we can avoid being manipulated by other people's arguments. In this class, we're going to be using the word rhetoric a lot. We're also going to be using the word argument and persuasion, and sometimes using them sort of interchangeably. I want to give you a couple definitions of rhetoric, and we'll talk about how many of them are in line, but some of them might be a little bit surprising. So one is the field of rhetoric examines how and why certain messages, images, or modes of communication, or what we call rhetoric, moves audiences. So that makes sense, right? That's in line with what I just mentioned. How do these messages move or compel audiences? Aristotle called it an ability in each particular case to see the available means of persuasion. We'll be talking about persuasion next week. We'll also be talking about Aristotle's rhetorical appeals. We'll be talking about that next week. Plato called it the art of winning the soul through discourse or conversation. The art of speaking and writing effectively. The study of how we form and act on opinions, of how these processes of persuasion work, and perhaps more importantly, how we might communicate more effectively to persuade other people. The last two are just from textbooks. The last one is a definition that you might have kind of had in the back of your mind or might sound kind of familiar. Language that is elaborate, pretentious, insincere, or intellectually vacuous. So you may have heard rhetoric be described as a discipline. You may have heard of rhetoric and composition or classes that study rhetoric, but you might have heard it used in this last sense. Words that are kind of empty, that sound good, that sound elaborate, that seem very persuasive, but actually there's nothing there. They're not saying a whole lot. Maybe you've heard politicians accuse other politicians of just empty rhetoric, right? They're saying something, it sounds elaborate and grand, but really it's just rhetoric, it's just words, it's just oration. There aren't really ideas there. So you can see that rhetoric can be used to mean something that's kind of empty, that's just elaborate and pretentious, but empty, but it can also mean real persuasion. Rhetorical analysis, which is what we're going to be doing a lot of this semester, is an attempt to answer some of these questions. How does the rhetorician make the argument? And for our purposes this semester, we're mostly going to be talking about written texts, right? As this is an English class. But we're actually going to start this semester by looking at visuals, by looking at images, advertisements, memes, things like that. So we can use the term rhetorician. That just means somebody who's trying to make an argument really broadly. We can be more specific. We can say writer or filmmaker or advertiser or graphic artist, but rhetorician is sort of an umbrella term that we can use here. How effectively does the rhetorician make the argument? Why or why not? What tools does the rhetorician use? We're going to be talking a lot about rhetorical devices. All of these tools that good rhetoricians use, and we're not even aware a lot of the time that they're using these tools, and you can learn how to use some of these tools too. How do all of the parts work together? And how can this text or this image or whatever it is that you're reading be read with the grain and against? So reading with the grain means you're going where the author is trying to take you. You have a stance of openness. You're letting the author kind of sweep you along. You're going with the author's current. It doesn't mean that you're being completely passive when you're reading, but it means that you are following along with the author's argument, doing your best to figure out what the author meant to say, the intended meaning. When you're reading against the grain, you're challenging some of those assumptions. You're asking yourself what the author might have left out. You're adding in your own questions. You're thinking about the historical context. If you were reading something like Little Red Riding Hood, you could read it with the grain, you could use the dominant interpretation, or you could sort of resist some of the patriarchal structure structures that are in the Little Red Riding Hood. You can question what's left out of Little Red Riding Hood. You could unpack it a little bit further. Good readers do both of these things at the same time. It's not as if your first reading is with the grain and your second reading is against the grain, not necessarily. You can do both of these things at the same time. It is important if you really like what the author has to say and you're in agreement and you find yourself nodding along, then it's extra important to try to read against the grain, to resist some of those readings. If you really disagree with everything the author says, or if you know the author's political affiliation and you already have made up your mind about what the author is saying, then it might be important to read with the grain, with the stance of openness, trying your best to understand what the author meant to say, what the author's intention is. So you want to do both of those things. As we're doing rhetorical analyses, we want to focus less on what is the argument, although what the argument is important. We want to focus on how the author or how the rhetorician or how the writer is making that argument. What tools are they using, and what leads you to that conclusion? On the next page, we have several images that I've just pulled from the internet. I want you to take a look at these and think about how all of these images are making some sort of argument. So some of them are serious, some of them are advertisements, some of them are memes, some of them are just kind of funny, some of them are political. Take a look at all of these and think about how they're making an argument, of course, what that argument is, and how they're conveying it, what tools are being used. Notice all sorts of details, things like color, font, context. And if you're having trouble, you can go back to those annotation guidelines that tell you what kinds of things you can be looking for when you're annotating a text. I know that might sound weird because these are images. It's hard to annotate an image, but if you're having trouble noticing details, you can go back to that annotation section and look for things you can unpack.